Well, thank you guys for joining today. I'm Hall Martin with 10 Capital. I know many of you there and many are new and looking forward to catching up with you in today's presentation. Today, we're going to spend a few minutes talking about the art of pitching and talk about some of the key aspects of that, since those raising funding really need to have good pitching skills to communicate well to the investor. And then those are great skills to take to the rest of your business, recruiting employees, recruiting partners, and managing the client base and so forth. So with that, let's go and kick into it. If you have questions, guys, just go and put them in the chat box, and then we'll stop and take questions. And then when we finish these, we'll open it up to all questions. But for the next 10 minutes, let's look at this and talk about the art of pitching as well. And so, in pitching your deal to an investor, it helps to know your investor first. I know we all have the standard deck and we can do the standard presentation, but if you can find out something about the investor, you'll find you can make a much better presentation by customizing it a little bit, especially after you have it memorized and practiced. You can then start to spend more time on that. And what you'll find is that there are different kinds of investors out there that you may be pitching. There are venture capital, there are angels, there's high net worths, and there's others. And the key is they have a little bit of a different care about when you go and talk to them. The venture capital, they want a 10x return. If you're not 10x, they're just not interested. It's got to be a very large market, very high growth rate. Angels have a little bit of a capital preservation going on there. So they look for initial traction, initial revenue. They want to see some of the risk coming out of the deal. And then high net worth, they also are looking for very good returns, but they're not always that strong on the technology. I find they tend to be, especially the family offices, tend to be a little bit risk averse when it comes to tech. And so you want to think about what the care abouts and concerns are of the investor that you're working with on it. And then the next thing you want to do is, emphasize a return that's appropriate for that investors. Venture capital is 10x, angels are 3 to 5x, and high net worths are 5 to 7x. And that's just been my personal experience with them, is what they look for in returns. And you can customize that a little bit in each of your presentations as well. If the investor has invested in a startup before, like yours, that's going to be a much more good prospect for you because they're familiar with the space. They maybe have had good luck with it. So again, the more you know about the investor, what they invest in, what they look for, what they've had success with, the better you can customize your presentation for that group. The same thing about the application in the market. Those who are familiar with your market space are going to be much more engaged than those who are not. Those who are not, you need to spend more time educating them. You have to show them more about how that market works, what's going on there. And so you may have to be spending a little bit of time bringing them up to speed on it. So the best way to pitch an investor is know something about them and then adjust your pitch accordingly. So let's go to the next slide. So one of the pitches you need to have is the elevator pitch. And fundamentally, it's the same content as what you had in your deck, but now you're using it in a shorter format. And instead of saying elevator pitch, I learned the other day, one way to say this is have your elevator story. Think about telling your story in a short format in order to get the message across and generate interest. The mistake I see a lot of people make is they decide to talk faster and cram more words into the time. But the better approach is just to choose your words more carefully. Instead of giving complete long sentences, you may want to think about keywords and phrases to communicate the different value props that you're in your deal. And so the other thing you want to think about is reducing your pitch down to 5 or 7 words or less. So for example, if the problem you're solving is diabetes will afflict 1 out of 3 people, the solution is we help cure diabetes. Have 5 and 7 word phrases for what you want to communicate throughout the pitch, so you don't have to put a lot of thought and a lot of filler words to get it out there. Next is when you get into financials, those can be hard to present, all those numbers. In a elevator pitch. The key there is to pick 1 or 2 key numbers and just mention that. We're going to be going cash flow positive in 18 months. We're growing 20% month over month growth rate. So pick 1 or 2 numbers and bake that into your elevator pitch as well. And then finally, talk about your market. Our total available market is $1.2 billion. Just put it out there, one number that people can grasp onto and get the sense that this is going to be a good deal. So by crafting short phrases and using keywords, you can cover the same topics, but with less detail, and then practice it so it flows smoothly. Let's go to the next slide. So the key here is anecdotes tell and numbers sell. What I find is it's great to use the story form to tell your pitch, or talk to the investors about what you're doing, and that's great. What I find helps is to add numbers on top of that. So when you use numbers, talk about what those are. Our customer ROI is 3x that of the competitors. Our growth rate is 110% quarter over quarter. These numbers start to validate the story that you're telling, and it makes it stronger. It makes it more specific. It also demonstrates your expertise. It shows your numbers. It shows your market. And wherever you drop a number in, you establish credibility. You don't need a lot of numbers, but key numbers here and there can really help make the investor more interested in your deal, because you're backing it up with some validation itself. I've always been a big believer that at the very early stage, you should be talking about the unit economic of your business model, not just how the absolute dollar volume is growing, but what is the cost of customer acquisition, what is the lifetime value. At a unit economic level, it's a good business, because unit economics can come into play even at the very early stage of it, and that can be very compelling to investors. So make sure you don't, if you see the investors, interest waning, start putting some numbers in it, and you'll start to see them perking up, because there's something that they can grasp onto in your presentation. Let's go to the next one. So next one is who in your team should pitch. Typically, it's the CEO that pitches, and that's because the investor wants to meet the CEO. They want to size them up for their communication skills, the passion for the project, the background, their expertise in the domain, etc. And so it's okay from time to time to have a CTO or CFO pitch, but by and large, the CEO should be coming out, because the investors are going to take that pitch much more seriously. And that's who's leading the deal, and they need to see that there's a very strong leader at the top of it. The next thing is, make sure as a CEO, you know your numbers very well and how the business model works. You can't pass it off to a CFO. You need to know your numbers also, and be able to answer all the questions that come up. And they could come up in a variety of different ways, not just about the market or the team, but also about the financials, about the cost structures, about the business model itself. And finally, the CEO should be selling it a little bit. There should be a little bit of salesmanship going on here. We're not just communicating a brief, but we're actually convincing people that this is going to happen. And that's what's key about a pitch, is that if you can convince them that what you're saying is going to happen with or without the investor, you'll find the investor is far more interested in this deal than if it depends solely upon the investor to make it successful. And that's what you have to do, is say, we're at point A today, and in 3 years we'll be at point B. And the investor, if they walk away thinking they're going to do that, they're very far down the path in order to write a check. So make sure that you're selling it a little bit as well. So let's go to the next slide. So next is how to answer the investor's questions. And this is not a very long one, but I find this comes up a lot. And basically, whenever I ask a question, like how much revenue do you have, I often get the same response, a story. Well, let me tell you about how I came up with this idea. Let me tell you, and I have to stop them and say, no, how much revenue do you have? That's a number. So, listen to the question and answer it directly to the point. And if they want to hear more, they want to hear the story, well, then let's go tell them the story. But if they don't, they may want to go forward. I've been in many a pitch session where the investor literally has 10 minutes to spend with us. They have 20 questions to go through, and there's just not enough time to go through the story on every single question. So think hard about the question that's being posed, answer it directly, and then see where they want to go forward from there. So make sure that we're answering the questions and making sure that we're coming up with what information they need, as opposed to everybody just needs to hear the story. Let's go to the next slide. So oftentimes, especially in the life science, medical device, and some other industries, we'll be listening to a very complex idea, and you're pitching something that is probably outside the wheelhouse of the investor itself. Maybe they know a little bit about it, but they probably are not an expert in it. So number one, know who your audience is that you're pitching to. Are you pitching to a savvy group of business people who are up on the technology in your space? If you are, that's great. You can go very deep on the technology. If they're not, then you can't go very deep on the technology, and you have to be able to present that information still in a compelling way. And so the way you do that, if you're not you don't have an expert group that you're dealing with, and in many angel group cases, that's the case. And so you have to choose your core concept, identify the core value proposition you have, and focus on explaining how that works, what the benefits of the technology, and not how the technology works. I find, especially with life science deals, people have a tendency to have to explain how everything works at a molecular level. And if you're a finance guy, that they could get lost in that. And so instead of talking about all of that, think about having a high-level analogy that explains the benefits of it without having to go too much into the science of it as well. Next, use some examples and context. Describe the problem the technology solves, and make sure that people understand that this is a large problem, it's an important problem, and here's how we're solving it as well. You can use metaphors and analogies. Think about coming up with different ways of explaining it. We had a life science deal come through recently, and they explained their technology as being the traffic cop for the immune system. And they talked about the traffic cop letting some deals go through and other molecules not, and redirecting in different ways. And I thought that was a great way of explaining a very complex technology to a novice audience as well. And finally, use straightforward language. Don't use acronyms. I had a guy, do a presentation the other day, and he kept talking about the BPA, and I had no idea what BPA was. And in fact, he finished the presentation and never did get to the BPA. So to this day, I don't know what BPA means. But the idea is just talking straightforward language and avoid the jargon or the tech speak that goes with it, as it can be off-putting to the investor. Let's go to the next slide. So here's my last slide, and basically most startups don't want to tell me their revenue because it's not very big. And I always have to remind them, most startups don't have big revenue. In fact, almost no one does, or they wouldn't be an early stage startup. But what investors really want is predictable revenue. And what the investors are looking for is, do you have systems running in your startup behind the scenes that are generating leads, closing sales, keeping the customers happy, retaining those customers? And so what you want to do is, even if those numbers aren't big, is show you have those systems running. And over time, the numbers will be big. We are growing, we are getting better, but we have systems in place and we have predictability. I used to work at a company where we had a 3-step process. We would generate leads, we would qualify them, and then we would have an internal salesperson call up to close them. You tell me how much revenue you want at the end of that process. I'll tell you how many calls that internal salesperson had to make. I tell you how many leads we had to qualify, and then I could tell you how many leads we had to generate. And it was a machine. We just knew how that worked, and so it was very clear what we had to do. And so that's what you want to get to, is predictable revenue means you have systems that are running and you know what the conversion rates are and the outputs. I find many early stage startups know those numbers, but they really don't present it that way. They just try to avoid telling me what the real number is as far as revenue, because they're afraid I'm not going to be interested because they only have 30K of MRR. Well, if you have a machine behind that, a system behind that, that is much more scalable and growable. And that's a real value proposition for the investor. So make sure we're talking about that aspect of it and not just the absolute size of the revenue and what's going on there. You're underselling the deal to a certain extent. So let's see what questions we have. I've had a few come in. So let's go and finish up the slides, and then we'll go do the questions. So after the pitch comes the investor discussion. Make sure you leave time in the presentation for the discussion. I sometimes see people get 10 minutes and they spend the entire 10 minutes talking. No, let's spend 5 minutes talking, and then let's spend 5 minutes asking questions of the investors to get feedback and to make sure we're answering what they need to know. If you can research the investors in advance, that's very helpful. And then after the pitch, make sure when you go back to the investor, you always have new information to share. You can't just show up and say, you know, I'm still raising funding and nothing's happened since the last time I'm talking to you, but here I am again, because it shows you're not bringing anything new to the table, and it shows nothing new is happening in the deal. And that's really not the message you want to put across. What you want to put across is something always good is happening. Let me tell you about the latest deal that's going. So you always need to have updates that are going on. And we like to focus on the core four of sales, team, product, and fundraise, because those are the core things that you're dealing with that really drive the business as well. So let's make sure we have that coming up every time you go back to see an investor. The more updates you have, the more shots on goal you have in going back to him. And so with that, let's go and look at the questions. Okay, so what kind of things in an answer will give high net worth individuals a heart attack? I think the key answer for high net worth is we really haven't put any of our own money into it, and we really can't do anything until we get 500K of revenue or 500K of funding. And what that says is that, you know, I'm really not putting myself out for this. I'm really not putting my own money up for this. I'm just looking for somebody else to pay me to go do this. How about you? And that's really not what investors want to hear. They want to hear this thing is going to happen no matter what. And so you want to make sure that you're all in, you have passion, and you're doing things to make this thing move forward. Next question is, in your experience, if investors do not bite at the presentation, do they do so later in response to new emails? And the answer is absolutely yes. And one thing I find is you're presenting a snapshot in time. And what you need to do is over time, show how you're making progress going forward and show how you're building a little bit of a relationship. And the story I always tell is I ran 3 angel groups in Texas back in the 2000s. And what I witnessed in all 3 of them is entrepreneurs coming in and pitching to my room full of investors. 9% would pitch, go away, and we would never hear from them again. We have no idea what happened. They just disappeared on us. Well, they got little or no money out of it. 10% though came back, gave us updates, gave us reminders, told us, built a little bit of a relationship. And on the 4th or 5th update, out came the checkbooks. And that's because you have to go back and demonstrate the growth story, not just predict the growth story. And that's what so many presentations do. They say in the future, it'll be this. But if you can go back and say, we're now actually doing this and we're hitting the milestones and we're reaching our goals, and people start to get a sense there's momentum and traction, well, then they're going to come in. So the follow-up is very, very important to this process as well. Next one is from Kurt. How important is a team? I did not see it in your slides. Well, there's a lot of elements that are important here. You need to have a large market. You need to have a good solid team with complete skills and everything is covered and they know what they're doing and so forth. So this slide presentation was really not about the basics because everybody knows the basics. That team is probably the most important thing to put out there. This is really about the things that people may not have thought about for pitching that goes on top of that. So it's important to have a large market. It's important to have a great team. It's important to have a good solution to the problem. And the problem has to be a real pain point, not just something that vitamin solves. And so those are things I think most people know already. But here, hopefully, we've shed light on some new aspects of it as well. Next question is, oftentimes I hear a payback period of 2 to 3 years. How realistic? Let me see if I go back to that. Let's see. Oftentimes I hear a payback period of 2 to 3 years. How realistic is this, and does this vary per industry? And the answer is yes, it varies dramatically from one industry to the next, how much it takes to get a payback on it. Enterprise SaaS, you can often hear that 2 to 3 years is a good payback period. In fact, it can sometimes go faster if you're in a high growth area. Get into life science, it's much longer than that. So it just gives a level set as to how fast you're going to be able to generate revenue to cover the cost that goes into it. And so this is something that's very helpful to investors to know what those different things are and what you're expecting. A lot of the financials presentation in these decks go to showcasing what's in your mind as a startup founder. How fast do you think you'll grow? When do you think you'll go cash flow positive? What kind of cash burn are we expecting? And so investors learn a lot about that from about what you're thinking from that slide as well. So it's important to put some thought into that as well. Next question is 10x over what period? I have to go back and think about what we were talking about there, Andrew. If you give me more detail on it, what would you say? What exactly are you asking there, Andrew? If you want to unmute, you can always just ask me the question over the Zoom. Okay, or you can type it into the chat box.
Hang on, sorry.
Well, go ahead. So what do you mean by 10x over what period? What are we talking about there?
Yeah, when you referred to VCs and the other categories of investor, you said they expected an XXX return, and I wasn't clear on what period that was. So like the 10x was the VCs, 5x was the angels. I think you actually had a range for angels.
So, you know, the VCs have a 10-year life on their fund, but I'd say most of them are looking for 10x over a 5 to 7 year period. And so they're looking for, you know, a good size outsized return. And, you know, it's a 10-year fund and you're spending the first 3 years deploying. And so, you know, from the time you start to the time you finish, you know, the clock shifts out there, but they're looking for a 5 to 7 year window on that. Okay. Next question. I have generated 1 million ARR in my startup, showing a 3x year-over-year growth rate. I'm building a consumer brand, and for me, all investor interest to date is driven on our fast growth. Now that I'm in middle of raising a seed round, my growth is slowing down to 2x while I'm concentrating on finishing my fundraise. How do you think I should present a slowdown the growth rate while raising a fund? Well, typically you can, you know, people are, you know, you have different choices here for how you spend your time and your resources. Top line revenue is one, building out product is another, developing marketing channels or sales channels is another. And as you grow, you have to start spending time on these other things that are out there. So you have to, you know, what I would do is talk about how in this time frame I was growing 3x because I put everything into the growth. But now that we're getting to a certain size, I have to have more products. And so I'm spending time bringing new products up to speed, which will turn into 3x growth down the road. But for right now is 2x growth. And I'm now having to bring on new team members and spend some time with them as well. So talk about where your time is really going and show that is for the balance and for the better of the startup, and that we just can't put every penny into growth. We have other things. There are certain stages where you really want it to be growth, and that's usually at the Series A. Series A is all about growth. And then after that, you can do other things depending upon the competition, the market structure, what the goals of the business are as well. So think about the bigger picture of what you have to do to build a business and be able to put that in there as well. So we already answered the 10x question. So let's see. In the early stage of a business, what is impressive to include in a pitch? Without particularly impressive revenue and following, I find it difficult to grab attention from more established competitors. A couple of things that can be impressive. Number one, if you get a lead investor excited about your deal and they're wanting to fund and support it. So early stage is all about validation. You know, your family put money in, you put money in, customers are buying the product. All of those are validation points. And what you want to show is that you're getting validation all the way across it. Not getting high revenue, you're getting validation. The business model works. The growth story is happening. These are all validation points that you want to highlight to show that this is a working business and it's working on all fronts. It's working with the team, it's working with the product, it's working with the business model. All of these things are happening is what I would put it out there. But what can really get investors excited is to say you are getting, you know, attention from a very well-known lead investor. That's one. you're getting very strong customers signing up for it. In the consumer product good world, if you get into Whole Foods, that's one of the most demanding diligence processes you'll ever go through in the consumer product goods space. And so that's impressive to customers that you can meet their requirements on it as well. So think about what's difficult to do, and then if you can do it, then you can then start to showcase, that you've got something that's really standout as well. If you're up against a lot of competitors, then what you need to do is show what I call the competitive advantage you have. And I define competitive advantage as it gives you a 30% increase in revenue or a 30% decrease in cost over your competition. If there's something in your business model or your product or your sales plan that gives you an edge, you want to put that out there to show that even though I don't have a lot of revenue now, I've got some great things going on here. So those are some of the things I would look at to try to get more people going on it. Great. So anybody else have any questions? Let's go ahead, and if you want to unmute, you can also unmute and ask the question to the group as well. Who else has a question at this point?
Where are you finding the best people for pitching your products? So what that core group of people?
Well, as far as people that, startups that are successful at pitching, typically, experienced founders, who have pitched before, know what the investors are looking for. And so they're very good at that. And then finding investors who are going back into the operator role, they understand the situation from the investor side, and they're able to communicate how they're meeting the issues that come up for the investor. How will we get an exit? How do we know the team is going to work? How have we validated the market yet? Do we have product market fit? All these questions come up, and if you're already familiar with those and you're answering those before anybody asks, it shows you know what you're doing. And so I find experienced founders and investors who are going back to become operators for a particular deal to be some of the more successful ones as well. Industry expertise helps a lot too. People that really know their industry very well tend to do very well on the presentations, because they've got an expertise and a command of the domain that can be impressive as well. Now, if that's all you have, that's going to be a problem, because there's plenty of academics, for example, that know the industry well, but they don't know about business or marketing or sales, and that's going to be a problem later. Anybody else have a question?
Hey. Thanks. This has been very helpful. I just wanted to ask about closing deals, right? Because it's not only just about pitching well and knowing your stuff. How in the room, and I know you talked about really the follow-ups are as important as what happens in the room. What is your advice on the likelihood of closing deals right then and there, or versus happening in the follow-up? Is it the persistence? What can you advise us on how to actually close a deal?
I think you have to take the investor through the investment journey they have to go through. And you can't really rush them. You have to walk them through it. And so when you first pitch, you're checking to see if they're interested. And then on the next round, you're checking to see if you're gaining interest. It's getting stronger with them when you tell them more about it. And you then usually have to answer their questions. Risks are coming up in their mind, and you have to explain to them, here's how we mitigated those risks. And so you want to get the risks out on the table. That's why it's important to listen to the questions to figure out what that is. Once they have that information, at some point they have to do their due diligence. And so the way you help with that is you have your documents already put in a due diligence box ready to go. All the basic documents are here. They're well organized. You can walk your way through it. And one thing I found that some people did, especially with complex deals, is they would write their own due diligence report. They would basically take what's in that box with the patent filings and the entity filings and the financials, and they would write up a report, because sometimes people aren't quite sure how they're supposed to do due diligence. So if you write a diligence report out there, many examples on the website, you can then, they'll sit down, they'll read that, and then they will think, well, I've done my diligence because I read the report and I understand it, and it seemed like it answers all my questions about the risk. So you have to put them through a process where they go through it, but by all means, make it easy. We, in our program, require everybody to have a diligence box, or what they call a data room, with the core 5, 6, 10 documents in there. So if an investor goes into it, they feel like I have on some level have done diligence on this. Otherwise, they're not going to move forward. The next thing you want to do is start figuring out, well, how much are they going to invest? And you start with, are you interested? And then you move to the next level. What kind of range are we thinking about here? And they say maybe 50 to 100. Okay. And then the next meeting is, are we thinking more about 50 or more about 100? Okay, we're going to do 75. And so you're walking them through that process of interest to committed to setting a number to doing diligence to actually writing a check. And the key there is you have to break it down into steps. You can only do one step at a time, I find. Otherwise, people feel like they're missing something, or they're being rushed, or they're just not sure. So you want to map out all of those steps and make that easy for them. Instead of making them ask for the diligence box, just give it to them. Instead of asking for the report, just give it to them and do it. When it comes time to do subscription agreements, DocuSign it. Send it over. All they have to do is click, 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 boom, they've signed the documents. That way, I'm amazed at how many people send me things where I have to print it out, I have to sign 3 different places, and I have to look through there to figure out what that is. If I have to scan it back in, if I have to send it back to them, and they're wondering why is this taking so long? Well, it's just a lot of steps in today's office world. Why did we not just go and put a DocuSign on it where it's just click, 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 and then make that easy for them? So all they have to do is basically approve it, and then the technology takes care of the rest. And then the last one is send them the wiring instructions so they know where to send it, and you can move it over. You can come up with closing dates and those type of things, but I find if you keep them on a standard process that's just very steadily moving forward, you can get to the closing as well through that factor, as opposed to hoping they don't have to go do the due diligence. Because I find a lot of people stall out when they feel like they're missing steps and maybe making a mistake is what they're thinking.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Maybe a silly question, but of those five items in the due diligence box, what in your mind are those?
Oh, well, we always look for the entity filings. Is it Delaware C or is it an LLC? Patent filings. Half the value of a patent is with the investor. So if you think you're going to do anything with patents, get some provisionals done, put them in the box and get credit for that. Income statement and balance sheet, 3 to 5 year financial projections, good detail there to show that you've really thought this through, you know what you're going to do with the funds as well. And then if you have multiple products, you need a revenue by product. If you have multiple geographies, revenue by geography. So they really start to get a sense of what the revenue is and where it's coming from. And the last one is the cap table. You need to have a high level cap table in there so they know who owns what at just a very high level. They're not going to do a lot of math on it, but they're trying to see are the key people here incentivized to make this successful. And, does one person have 95% of the stock and the other 5 guys have 1% each? That the incentives will probably not work out well in that particular case. But those are the core documents we see in a diligence process. And if you have anything else to disclose, CVs, resumes, if there are lawsuits or whatever, you have to put the basic stuff in there. Usually at the very early stage company, we don't have a lot of that. There's not a lot of history there. There's not a lot of tax returns or that type of thing. It's really more the core 5 I just mentioned.
Okay, thank you. Very helpful. Awesome.
Paul?
Yes.
Prior to the pandemic, all presentations I ever heard of were done in person, in a kind of like the stage show. And during the pandemic, some have been online. From your presentation, it sounded as though you're getting ready for a return to the former method now that the pandemic's receding. Is that right?
Yes, for example, angel groups were all in person before, they were all online during, and now they're a hybrid mode afterwards. I will say, half the people show up to present in person, the other half are zooming in primarily because of geography. It's too far to travel for just a half-hour pitch, we'll just zoom in. However, if you do actually go out to the pitch, you probably have more opportunities to network, build a relationship. And so there is advantages to going in person. And we'll see, I think, hybrid models going forward in a lot of groups. I will say that a lot of groups are now moved to the first presentation, and the first pitch is online. Before we drive across town or fly across country, let's just see the pitch. And then if this is going someplace, well, then somebody's getting on a plane to go somewhere. So up front, I'm seeing that still being the same. And another question, how would I pitch asking for funding to build the MVP? What would investors be looking for to say yes? And so, the MVP is still, there's a lot of validation you can put in there. For example, you could create a landing page and track how many people came to it. You can see how many people converted on it. You can see how many people, went out to a faux e-commerce page and tried to buy something. MVP is not just one unit, it's many, many tests. And before you actually build a physical product, you want to do a lot of other tests along the way to show this idea works. There's a market there, people will pay money for it. And you have a test for each one of those to show that we're actually doing it. I think one of the best MVPs I ever heard was a guy had a solution he was selling online. And so he took $5,000 of his own money, went out and did a Facebook advertising campaign, generated a certain number of leads, some number of those closed, and then he had an average sell of what people actually bought. And he was able to calculate a CAC LTV rate out of that by saying it costs this much to acquire them, and this many people bought it. And so he had his conversion rates already set up before he ever got to actually building the true MVP. And he only cost him $5K of his own money to go do some basic ads. So this is what you want to do before you start building products, is to start doing simple tests and validations to show that we're on the right track. We've got a lot of lessons learned here about what's working and what's not. And then when we get to building an actual product, we're actually starting to get a little bit deeper into it. And with that, we can get deeper feedback from the client as well, or the customer.
Yeah, wouldn't that be a POC versus the MVP if you're talking about testing before it's actually launched?
Well, they can be kind of the same thing. An MVP is really just one or two features to see, get out there, engage the market, get feedback, and half of it is to inform your product development. The other half is to convince investors we're figuring this thing out. So it goes to both in that case. But, I find that, true MVPs really aren't first versions of your product. Because so many times you get out there and find out, we got the wrong package, we got the wrong price, we got the wrong, feature set here. And the true first version of the product often comes out to be very different, because after all of the MVPs you've done, you found that we really didn't have the right approach up front. I hear that from more than half the startups coming through. What we originally came out with really didn't work. And some people did very simple MVPs to find that out. Some people raised 500K to find that out. And so you want to be, the guys figuring it out on the cheap, because when I worked at my former company, the first version of whatever we came out with was an MVP, whether we told them that it was that or not. And so, and then over time, we would upgrade it and make it better. And sometimes there were small changes, sometimes there were big changes that went into it. So keep the MVPs cheap and keep them often, do multiple MVPs and test different aspects of the solution. Do we have the right feature set? Which is the right feature? Do we have the right price? Do we have the right conversion rate? Do we have the right conversion platform for it? And then start to, with all those lessons learned, you can then start to make a pass at a first version of the product that you go to market with. But all those MVPs, those count with investors. Capture the information and show what you've done, because that's very impressive to investors. Very few people actually do true cohort analysis. Or if they do, they don't tell the investor about it, which is a shame, because that's what investors are looking for. I'm looking for validation. I'm looking that you know this. from real world experiments, not just what was brainstormed up, because we know how successful that is. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Mhm. Great, thanks.
Thank you, Hal.
Great. Any other questions here? We're getting near the end of our 45 minutes. If we need to stay longer, we can, but if we've got them answered, that's fine too. Any last questions you guys have for us today?
Oh yeah, hey, Hal. So I got a question. So for the pitch, typically, we should write out the whole script or just some main points, and then just on the fly and do the pitch. How should we do it? Thank you.
Right. You want to write out the main points. You want to have talking points, not a script. The script will come out stilted and look like you're reading something, and that you know the presentation needs to come from the heart a little bit. And so when you do these presentations, what I always do is look at my slides and say, okay, what's my message on this slide? I pick 1, 2, no more than 3 messages that I'm going to say. And then when I get there, I just give those 3 messages out. And I say them in different ways, because sometimes you want to change it for different people, make it relevant to them and so forth. So you don't really want to write out a script. You really want to write out what are the messages I have on each slide that I want to communicate. In a 12-slide deck and 2, 3 messages each, you're looking at 24 to 36 messages. And then they need to kind of flow, you know, smoothly from one to the next. So you want to practice it from that. So one thing we didn't talk about is how to build a pitch deck. So unless anybody has any other questions, I'll close with this. The way you want to build a pitch deck is get your 12-slide template. You know, there should be 1 slide for every section of the business plan. What's the problem? What's the solution? What's the product? What's the competition? Who's the team? What's the competitive advantage? What's the business model? What's the financials? What's the investment opportunity? What's the exit? So there's about 12 slides you want to put in there. You put that into get a good template, go through, and on each slide, write out what your message is. What do I want to say on this slide? What do I want to put out there? Maybe 3 points. You know, just 5, 6 word bullet points on each slide, because you want to think about what am I wanting to say before I actually try to say it. Most people just go out and just start typing in what they think they want to put on the slide, but they haven't really thought through the messaging first. After you have all the messages up there, well, then you go back and you convert some of those words into graphs or to charts or to images. Some you wordsmith into, very nicely worded 5, 7 word bullet points. And then now you have all of your slides put together. Then you go back through and start to practice it and see if it flows. And you may have to reorder slides in order to tell the story. I had this problem, I developed a solution. Now other people are coming to me to buy it. And so I decided to make a product out of it. And so I found this team, and, the story should flow a little bit as it goes through. And your history there could be one format for doing the presentation as well. But the first thing on a slide deck is figure out what you want to say. What were your messages? And then figure out how to render it on the screen. And that's the part where you may want to pass it off to a graphic artist to actually make that look good, get the right glyphs and the right graphs, and make it look professional. Content has to come from you, but you don't have to be a master graphic artist to make that work at the end. But that's what I do on building a pitch deck, is make sure you know what you want to say before you try saying it. Is there any other questions before we wrap up? All right. Well, thank you guys for coming out today. Appreciate great questions. Thanks so much for joining us today. If anybody needs help with fundraising, by all means, let us know. We're always here for that as well. And with that, we'll go ahead and close it out, and we'll see you guys next month. Appreciate you joining us.
Thanks, Hal. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.